Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to this webinar on the topic of trade secrets and COVID vaccine manufacturing. My name is Philip Stevens. I'm the Executive Director of Geneva Network, which is a UK-based think tank and research group focusing on innovation, trade, and development policy. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this issue, I guess that's some of you at least. The issue is around COVID vaccines has become the issue of intellectual property rights. It's become key. Some have argued that suspending IP rights to allow any company to manufacture these vaccines is the key to faster access, particularly to developing countries and a swift end to the pandemic. And these arguments have culminated in a proposal at the World Trade Organization for a temporary global waiver on COVID-19 related intellectual property rights. Implementing such an IP waiver throws up many practical challenges, not least the problem of trade secrets, which are a key intellectual property right that protect the complex manufacturing processes that underpin the production of COVID-19 vaccines. And without access to these trade secrets, rival manufacturers will struggle to make copy or generic versions of these proprietary and high-tech vaccines. So we're very happy today to have a very eminent panel of expert speakers to give us their views on this topic. We're joined by Jim Pooley, who was a former Director General at the World Intellectual Property Organization, where he ran, among other things, the Patent Cooperation Treaty, a scholar in trade secrets for many decades, an expert litigator and counsel to companies large and small on the topic of trade secrets. We have Jayashri Wattal, who was an Indian negotiator during the TRIPS agreement and has worked at the World Trade Organization for many years on the topic of TRIPS. And if there's anything about TRIPS that Jayashri doesn't know, it's probably not worth knowing. And finally, we're joined by Professor Mark Schultz, who's a professor of intellectual property law at the University of Akron in the United States, trade secret expert and the author of, amongst many other publications, the Global Trade Secret Index, which is a global index of how countries are faring with regards to trade secret protection. To everyone watching today, I'd invite you to send in comments if you have some points you want to make. If there's some good ones, I'll try and read them out at the end, and hopefully there'll be a bit of time at the end to put your questions to the panelists. So please do send them in via the chat box. So we have 1 hour, which is not a huge amount of time for such a complicated topic. But I thought it'd be great to start, particularly for those who are less familiar with the world of IP, what exactly trade secrets are. I think most people are familiar with patents and copyright and trademark, but trade secrets are the slightly less known intellectual property right. So Mark, please give us your sort of quick 2-minute 101 on what trade secrets are and how they differ from other IP rights.
Thanks, Philip. So I think the name trade secrets tells you much of what you need to know. So the first word, trade, right? The information has commercial value to a business, and it gets an advantage from keeping that information secret. The information must be secret, and that means it's unknown outside of the business and not easy for others to uncover. And this type of information tends to include things like blueprints, manufacturing processes, particular formulas, recipes, techniques. It also can include things like customer lists, supplier lists, if those things are not generally known to the public. Now, there's something to understand, though, about trade secrets. Trade secrets aren't secrets in the conventional sense, in the way that people usually understand that term. The American statesman Ben Franklin once famously said that 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Now, we don't think of trade secrets quite that way. It's true that the information can't be generally known in an industry, and it must be reasonably protected by the owner. However, trade secrets are meant to foster business collaboration. They're meant to replace what would otherwise be locks and a very tight circle of secrecy with legal protection. that allows a business to share the secret with more of its employees. It allows a business to hire strangers. We found in research that in countries with weak trade secret protection, family businesses tend to dominate because you only do business with people you trust. Trade secrecy allows you to do business with strangers because you can rely on the legal protection for trust. You must keep that circle of trust unbroken, but so long as you do, and so long as the information doesn't become generally known, you can use it to collaborate, you can invest in it to grow your business and develop new techniques. And thus trade secrets, although they are certainly a form of IP that protects information from disclosure and isn't generally shared, it does allow for greater collaboration and sharing than happens in its absence. So that's how trade secrets are particularly unique. They're particularly widely used as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Jim, we'd appreciate your view on this. Is there anything you'd like to add to what Mark has said about what trade secrets are in particular?
Well,
how do trade secrets fit into the innovation ecosystem, and how important are they to knowledge-based companies in particular?
Well, they're critical. I mean, all patents, all innovations start out as trade secrets because that's how businesses protect the inspiration and the innovations that they come up with. One might wonder, why are we dealing with this now? TRIPS has been with us for quite some time, and didn't we already address these issues in the Doha Declaration and discussions after that? And I think one aspect for everyone to keep in mind about why secrecy is so critical now is the difference between pharmaceuticals based on a small molecule that is very easy to reproduce if you just read the patent that describes that molecule. In contrast, the kind of vaccines we're talking about here are biologics, and producing them is very, very tricky. And I mean, almost incomprehensibly tricky, that requiring very, very careful adjustments to quite a long process. So you need a huge amount of know-how. And that brings us back to what Mark was just talking about. Trade secrets are different than patents are a government grant of monopoly. And there's a cost, societal cost to that, but in return, we get disclosure of a specific invention. And we know what that is because we can read the patent. Whereas with trade secrets, there isn't any monopoly grant. No one is prohibited from working in the same technology. It's just that the owner of the information keeps control over it. And it's much more complex, typically, this kind of information, and a little bit harder to transfer. Now, as Mark pointed out, you can do it, and businesses do it all the time. And in respect to the biologics that are used in vaccines, a great deal of licensing was happening, but the licensing takes time. It requires a certain amount of trust in the partner that the information is being shared with, so that you can be comfortable that it's not going to be disclosed and that it's only going to be used in the area for which it's been licensed. And you, very importantly, have to feel comfortable that the person who gets the information is in a jurisdiction is in a country that has good laws where you can enforce that trust. And so all of those issues come to play here. The important thing is keeping in mind, this is not about patents. This is about something different, very different, that requires a consensual relationship in order for it to work.
Thanks, Jim. And then building on that, Mark, and zooming in more specifically on the COVID vaccines which have been invented over the last year or so. How have trade secrets helped in that process of scaling up vaccine manufacturing? So we're in a position now where there are billions of doses being manufactured every year, and it's not just the main innovators who are doing the manufacturing, but it seems to be lots of other groups are getting involved, lots of other companies. What role have trade secrets played in that role? And just as a plug, Mark's written quite an interesting pamphlet on this topic, which is published today. I'll share the link to everyone in a minute, so you can have a closer read of this topic. But Mark, perhaps you could spend a couple of minutes telling us what your views are on this.
Sure, thank you. And yes, please read that paper and another paper I have forthcoming. I did some parallel research, and as part of that research, we talked to, we spoke widely to about a dozen biopharma executives, some of them experts in manufacturing, and many IP counsel, and of course we widely surveyed the sources and agreements, publicly available agreements or publicly announced agreements regarding cooperation on this topic. Now, as Jim said, the manufacturing biologics is more complex. And to boil it down, historically, and perhaps to oversimplify, but historically, new drugs were chemicals or compositions that were synthesized using a fairly well-known process, and they were manufactured using a fairly well-known process. And where the innovation happened was in the drug exploration, determining what potential new substance could work. By contrast, biologics are made using a novel, complex process. They're first, synthesized and created using a novel and complex process. They're discovered that way, and they're manufactured using a novel and complex process. At every step of getting a biologic from lab to patients, that there is innovation and tremendous investment and new things happening at every stage. And one key point to understand about this process is that it's a cooperative process. There's nobody goes it alone. There is technology you have to license in at every step. At least that's been the case with respect to vaccines. BioNTech and Pfizer had to license patents. They work with manufacturers in the process, some of whom have their own proprietary processes and own trade secrets. So here are some examples of important key trade secrets. So some of the manufacturing partners that make key components for both viral vector vaccines that are made by both AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, and mRNA vaccines, the ones made by Pfizer and by Moderna, use as a key component plasmid DNA. Plasmid DNA is extremely important to the modern biologics industry. And a study in August 2020, about a year ago, 13 months ago, found that at that time, there was only enough manufacturing capacity in the world to meet about a quarter of the world's needs for vaccines. So what happened in the last year? Tremendous investment in plasmid DNA production. And the plasmid DNA is produced by a variety of companies. Now, interestingly, if you're a downstream producer, a user of plasmid DNA, like Pfizer or Moderna, you may think of plasmid DNA as a commodity. But each of those companies has its own production process. Each of those plasmid DNA manufacturers optimizes its process, and it has a number of trade secrets involved in making plasmid DNA. Now, plasmid DNA is a potential bottleneck. It's difficult to make, batches are easy to spoil. And so one particular company, Touchlight Genetics Ltd, has developed a proprietary process for producing a synthetic DNA vector. Now, this is patented technology, but has worked for several years to refine its manufacturing process to the point where it can now participate in biologics production. Another example is the tremendous amount of work Pfizer and other companies had to do to develop the capacity for the first time to manufacture mRNA vaccines at scale. They'd only been produced for testing, for trials. It's the difference between making something in a test tube and making it at industrial level processes. And so Pfizer developed a 50,000 step process. It worked with 86 different suppliers, requiring 280 materials in total, 10 to 15 of which are novel to the mRNA vaccine. Over time, they've been able to cut the initial production time in half. That's pretty important, right? We all want those vaccines as quickly as we can get them. And so all of these steps constitute Pfizer's know-how. Some of them will be generally known in the industry. Some of them will be fairly obvious and won't be secret, but some of those steps are important steps that they've invested billions in creating. So these are some of the examples of key components of trade secrets that are used in the process. And Pfizer and Moderna and pretty much every company, as you'll find in our paper, and I'll discuss later in this webinar, is working with partners, including some of their key competitors, and revealing these processes, these trade secrets and know-how, relying on legal protection in order to do so, but all with the goal of increasing capacity and getting vaccines to people as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Mark. Like Mark said, if you're interested in learning about the detail of this, there's a lot of case studies and detail from on the ground. Do click on the link and have a read of that paper after the webinar. Also, a reminder to send in any comments and questions, which I'm happy to read out or stick to the end if there's questions that need answering. Jayashri, don't worry, we'll turn to you in a moment. We haven't forgotten you. But before we move on to TRIPS, I wanted to turn to Jim one more time. And as someone who's worked very closely with trade secrets owners over the years, what do you think would be the impact on owners of trade secrets businesses if the trade secrets were disclosed as per the waiver? And how would that contrast with a compulsory license, which you would see for a patent?
Yeah, well, again, as I said earlier, that there's just an important difference between patents on the one hand and trade secrets. You can read a patent and know what's there. Secrets require a huge amount of cooperation in order to pass the data from the originator to the licensee. And this that environment of trust requires that there be a lot of good, robust laws in the local legal framework to enforce the trust. And the impact of sort of coming in to a process like this, in which it's not all been private money, there's been government money too, but private investment has taken on the risk of producing these vaccines. The issue, if you can just easily imagine, when the next pandemic comes, if we have abandoned legal protection for these innovations and have removed the ability of the people who are investing in them to get a return by keeping control over them, then it's pretty obvious that you're going to end up with quite a bit less private participation and funding. So it really comes down to being extraordinarily careful about the effect on the incentive to produce all of this information by companies that have to show a return to their shareholders for taking the risk in putting these things together. So we have kind of a choice, which we've always had, between private funding of these kinds of medications and treatments and public funding. And to the extent that we want to rely on private funding, it's very important that we continue to maintain the incentives that are there to recoup the investment and pay for the risk that was taken. So that's really what's at risk here. We can't afford to make a mistake, because when the next pandemic comes around, we have to have private industry ready to help respond to it.
Just to play devil's advocate, I mean, what's wrong with public funding? I mean, why not get rid of the trade secrets and allow the public sector to?
That's a choice. That's a choice. I mean, the international community could get together and decide this is so important to us as as a population of the world, that we are going to fund this, and we're going to set up all the instruments that are necessary to do it in the various facilities and so on and so forth. My own experience in Geneva, and I don't want to speak for my much more learned colleague here, but she knows more than I do. The prospect of achieving that kind of agreement with the kind of investment that it would require is daunting. It would be lovely if it could happen, but I doubt it.
Mark, did you want to interject that?
Yes, a couple things I'd like to underline. We talked to a lot of people in the biopharma industry, and people in that industry have worked with a sense of mission and purpose for the last year, many of them working, essentially 7 days a week for the past year to produce these vaccines. And, at least for, I think, individuals working at these companies, maybe not the chief financial officer who looks at the balance sheet, but for individual researchers, manufacturing experts, they want to develop cures. They care about people. And so from the point of view of the biopharma industry, they often said, look, if the next pandemic comes, it's not that we won't step up. It's not that our industry will disappear if there's a waiver, but we will inevitably have fewer resources, and we will have to work in different ways, because inevitably, if you take away trade secrets or if you create this political risk, two things happen. One is collaborating becomes more risky. So you're going to hold your information closer. You're less likely to deploy it in countries that are less friendly to IP rights. You're less likely to work with partners and spread your information out and make it vulnerable to being taken. It's just an inevitable process. People don't do it out of spite. It's a natural reaction. The same thing happens with respect to investors. Let's not forget that companies like BioNTech and Moderna started out as startups just a decade ago. They took in billions of dollars of private money, and they succeeded. Other companies also took in billions of dollars of private money as startups and failed. Failure is something that investors accept, and they have to understand that most likely, most of their investments in the biopharma startup sector won't work out. But what is intolerable is that success leads to political risk, that success makes it more likely that your investment will be appropriated. What happens when that is the prospect you face as an investor? Well, you don't avoid the sector out of spite. You put your money in safer places. It's much safer to invest in a lifestyle brand or food or hospitality instead of life-saving products that may indeed be subject to political risk. So it's just the money will naturally flow elsewhere. And as I said, it's not out of spite. It's because in many cases, you have institutional investors investing people's pension funds, and they also have responsibilities to avoid excessive risk, especially if the prospect of return is taken away. So there's a natural reaction to doing something like taking trade secrets that happens not because people are mean or unkind, not because they don't believe in the mission of helping people, but because everybody has responsibilities to their stakeholders and they need to avoid losing investments.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe food and hospitality is not the safest place to invest right now, but point taken.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then, okay, so taking a step back and looking at the international architecture of IP rights and how this waiver ties into that. Jayashri, I know, has some interesting opinions on this issue. I'm sure, as everyone knows, the TRIPS agreement is the international agreement which governs IP rights, which countries have to implement, and member states of the WTO have to implement in their national legislation. Covers trademarks, patents, and trade secrets as well. So if the waiver were enacted, Jayashri, what does it actually mean in practice for WTO members' obligations on trade secrets as written into the TRIPS agreement? What are your views on that?
Thanks, Philip. So, taking off from where Jim left off, actually, on trade secrets, a waiver on trade secrets versus a compulsory license on patents. So in the case of trade secrets, as both Jim and Mark have said, the product covered by trade secrets can be validly used or reproduced even if the copier, so to speak, has arrived at that secret independently. So there is no protection, patent-like protection for that product, which is covered by only trade secrets and not patents. So what would it mean in terms of TRIPS obligations? The TRIPS obligation is that anything that is commercially, that is secret and has commercial value, and where reasonable steps have been taken by the owner to keep it a secret, such secrets shall be protected. So what are they protected against? They're protected against theft. So if you waive Article 39 of TRIPS, which is covering trade secrets, what would it mean? It would mean that you could steal trade secrets. But could you really steal trade secrets? I mean, what would you do to steal it? I mean, in my view, all that it means is that the enforcement provisions, which are in Part 3 of TRIPS, which are really covering only civil remedies, at least that's the obligation. There are no criminal remedies available for theft of trade secrets. So those civil remedies would no longer apply to a country that has acted upon a waiver which has been passed in the WTO, which has gone through in the WTO. So that's what it would mean. Now, how many countries really have the capability of engaging in this kind of, I would say, industrial espionage? You need to have a pretty large army of people looking out for this thing and spying and getting into the act of actually stealing trade secrets. So those are the countries or those are the companies that would gain from such a waiver. Not everyone. I mean, we're not talking about all low and middle income countries suddenly being able to access all the trade secrets all over the world. It will be probably a handful of actors in the world who would be able to really rely upon this waiver in order to use the information they already have and not have anyone sue them in their countries. That's what it would mean. Or take a dispute to the WTO. That's what it would mean as far as trade secrets are concerned. I may be wrong. I stand to be corrected, but those are my views.
Jim, I see you looking concerned, well, not concerned, but interested in that. Do you have anything else to add on that point?
If you were talking to me, yeah. I mean, yeah. I take the point that what's being discussed is just a waiver of Article 39, and maybe not much would happen, but if you remove the legal consequences for the transfer or disclosure of information that's highly valuable, I don't think it's realistic to expect that it's going to simply sit where it is and not propagate in ways that are out of the control of the original owner and that therefore reduce the value of the asset. And so I don't think, I mean, I agree the people who will have an interest in this is not everybody in the world, because you have to have places and people who know how to deploy this information if they have it. But the loss, the potential loss to the to the originator, the investor, is enormous and basically incalculable. And so there may be a way through this thicket, but so far experience has shown that the only reliable way to transfer this kind of information is to do it voluntarily and cooperatively. That is, where you have the company that owns the information sitting down with the licensee that has been deemed trustworthy and teaching them about how to do this, how to make this process actually work. That's really the way that you're going to get there. I also want to underscore one other point here we may get to later. The kind of technology that we're talking about here is broadly applicable to these biologics. It's not just COVID-related vaccines. And so if you engage in a process that removes all consequences for distribution of this information, then you're enabling the competitors to act in competition and use the information on other issues besides COVID. So it's something that has value beyond just the current issues with the current problems that we're facing.
Thanks, Jim. On that, we've got a comment from Brian Mercurio, who writes, proponents of the waiver seem to want to force technology transfer / trade secrets and seem to think this information can be given back to companies after the waiver concludes. I cannot conceive of a way to do this. We just discussed that. And Jayashri, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to add something else?
Yeah, I think, I mean, whether you can give it back or not is, I mean, it's clearly, once the secret is out, it's difficult to get it back. And I take Jim's point that, once the technology gets out somewhere to somebody other than the owner of the trade secret, then the likelihood that it will leak to others and spread without control of the trade secret owner is going to be high. And I agree with that. The point the other point, which I think many in the audience would like to know, is there a way that any country can force a trade secret owner to reveal trade secrets? We've talked about how it's best to be in a, to license it in a cooperative way. And that's the only way, one-to-one transfer of everything that you know about that manufacturing process or whatever it is that you want to get at. That's the best way of doing it. But is there a way that any WTO member can force the trade secret owner to reveal trade secrets? We know that it can be done in patents. We have Article 31, use without authorization of the right holder. That is non-voluntary use of the patent. And as Mark and Jim have both talked about, small molecules are the example in the pharmaceutical field or the biopharmaceutical field, which comes to mind, where even without the cooperation of the right owner, such small molecules could be replicated to quite high quality standards. However, that doesn't seem to be the case with trade secrets, with biologics, including vaccines, where you do need the cooperation of the right holder. What if you're not getting it and you are desperate, you need to get it? Now, we have an experiment in law, which was tried by Brazil. So there was a bill which went through the lower house and the Senate in Brazil. And there was a toing and froing about this bill. But what was the bill about? The bill was about amending the Brazilian compulsory licensing provisions, and with a proviso that if the patent owner on whom a compulsory license has been issued, on whose patent a compulsory license has been issued, would not cooperate and give the licensee, the compulsory licensee, its trade secrets, all the technological know-how that is needed to manufacture, as well as the starting biological materials. If such a thing were to happen where the patent owner did not part with all of these voluntarily, then the patent owner in Brazil could face the revocation of his patent or patents. There could be several patents involved. So that was the proposal in the bill that went up and down, as I said. But eventually, the presidential assent was given to this bill without this clause of, revelation of trade secrets on pain of revocation. So that clause was dropped. And according to a statement from the office of the president that I've seen in the press, it was said that these provisions were seen as being too difficult to implement and would discourage investment in researching new technologies in Brazil. Yeah. So that was one experiment that everyone, all of us who are involved in TRIPS and intellectual property were looking at to see what would happen. But obviously that went through, and we still don't know the answer to whether you can actually force, and what would be the method of forcing a trade secret owner to part with his trade secrets, the technical know-how, as well as the starting biological materials, both of which are important, and both of which, some actors in civil society have advocated.
I just want to add this. I don't think there's too much of controversy around the ability of governments to force something. The question is, what are the consequences if you do that? And of course, with the Brazilian proposal, we never got a chance to see, but I think it's almost inevitable. What you would have seen was a drop in the use of the patent system, because the cost of trying to get a patent all of a sudden becomes having to disclose all of your information and materials transfer and all of that. The governments have the ability to seize anything that they want according to the national laws. What we're trying to talk about is a system, trying to adjust or preserve the international system for intellectual property rights to the benefit of the world as a whole. And what kinds of actions can governments take that will preserve the incentives that framework was intended to create in the first place? Sorry, Mark, I jumped in.
Mark.
I guess a few points I think are worth making. First, there's the interesting question of whether governments could do this instead. And in theory, I suppose if you're just drafting an economic model with a few variables, you just substitute public production for private. But the reality is quite different. Most startups fail. Most pharma startups fail, and most new candidate treatments fail. This sector is characterized by tremendous loss. Yes, a few products make up for it, but will the political process tolerate that kind of loss? I think historically we see what happens when democratic governments try to invest in technology. It always becomes a campaign issue. We saw this in the US with one presidential administration investing in green tech. When some of those startups inevitably failed, it became a political issue. it's difficult for governments to invest in failing ventures. It's also public money they're losing. The advantage of the private sector doing it is it's private money that's being lost. Moreover, you get more shots on goal when you have many private companies competing. And some of them do things that the scientific establishment often considers eccentric, unlikely to succeed. And guess what? One of those technologies that was considered unlikely to succeed, perhaps even eccentric for many years, was mRNA vaccine technology. There were first a few dogged researchers who supported this, and then a couple of biotech companies that were of several biotech companies, but that were often doubted by many commentators. Some people were bullish on these companies, but many doubted that they would ever amount to anything. So if you assembled a council of learned people to decide what governments should invest in, I would be willing to bet they would not have recommended the government invest in mRNA technology. So I think that's one difficulty. One more thing I'll note is that tech transfer is a process that is unlikely to happen involuntarily. There's a Wall Street Journal article I commend to everybody about Pfizer's tech transfer process. It has been, for the last 18 months, it has been looking for partners that had capacity to help it with manufacturing. The Wall Street Journal story tells the story of working with a sophisticated partner, Thermo Fisher, and their plant in Italy. It's taken 7 months, a team of 24 people from Pfizer, working with these people in the plant side by side, teaching them how to make the vaccine, working hard to comply with regulatory requirements. And so 7 months later, as of now, the parties are completing the process and submitting data to regulators for approval. Now, another important stage in the process of manufacturing vaccines is simply filling vials of them for shipping. This is called fill and finish. And the Wall Street Journal reported that just transferring the knowledge of filling and capping the vials usually takes about 18 months and involves 10 stages, each consisting of hundreds of steps during which dozens of things can go wrong. So let's imagine these things being done involuntarily. It's rather implausible that a company being forced to do them and essentially giving away its technology that you can do this effectively, quickly, and efficiently. Thank you.
Just on that, we've had a message in from Stan Kowalski, who writes, from a technical standpoint, in the context of the Pfizer vaccine, trade secret information would be grossly inadequate for the manufacture of complex lipid nanoparticles, which are the main carriers of RNA. People would be necessary, i.e. collaboration with technical personnel. Information alone could be catastrophic, such as lipid nanoparticles require ultra pure ethanol, which is highly explosive. Just imagine, ... triple exclamation mark. And Mark,
Yes,
just before you go, your views on how to force this tech transfer. Are there any legal remedies or laws on the books that could theoretically make this happen, in your view?
Well, I think human history shows that when governments want to make people do things, there's all sorts of ways of making them do things. And even in democracy, those things can happen through selective, let's say it's often called euphemistically arm twisting. You can condition licensing of products, you can condition participation in markets. Governments can use antitrust or competition policy enforcement. I think in the end, the question is whether it will get you the results you want. I think we've been talking in depth about the unintended consequences and whether it destroys the system, which is a point Jim made. And I think those need to be kept in mind. And I think there's even an ethical point to consider that, what do we owe ourselves in the future? What do we owe future generations with respect to innovation when the next pandemic comes? If governments had actively seized technology 15 years ago, there might not have been BioNTech or Moderna that was here to help us at this moment in time. So it's not just a dynamic economic incentive we need to consider. We do need to consider, yes, the needs of people right now, and we need to do things to help those people. But we also need to remember that the system we have in place benefits future generations and will solve future problems if we don't destroy it.
A comment in from Olga Gergula, which I'll put to Jim. Competition law has tools to force owners of trade secrets to share technologies. What's your take on that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yes, no, it has happened from time to time as a punishment for those who have abused their monopoly power position. And the government has required them as a means to mitigate the effects of that illegal behavior to distribute, to disclose information to their competitors. I mean, that in advance of this talk, we exchanged information about the Microsoft, the order that required Microsoft to provide secret interoperability information to its competitors about 15 years ago. And so that is done in those circumstances as a specific remedy for a company that has been found to violate antitrust laws. That's true.
Thank you, Jim. Now turning back to the TRIPS agreement and Jayashri. So a lot of the civil society support for the waiver is based on the claim that TRIPS flexibilities, as outlined in the Doha Declaration, are insufficient to deal with this issue of COVID vaccine manufacturing, and therefore a broader waiver is warranted. Is there any justification in such claims? What are your views? I mean, is the Doha Declaration not sufficient to deal with a health emergency such as COVID? And are such demands justified for a waiver, in your view?
So I've tried to understand what civil society has said about TRIPS flexibilities. And it boils down to the fact that most of the flexibilities that we're talking about have to do with patents only. And they want flexibility, the waiver, to cover copyright, industrial designs, not undisclosed information, including test data, and so on. So that is one. The Doha Declaration doesn't talk about test data protection or trade secrets and so on. It talks about patents. So that is one that they have pointed out to why it is not sufficient. And the second is they talk about a lot of pressure not to use flexibilities. Now, on the second point, I'm not sure that anyone in this pandemic is going to say you don't have the right to use compulsory license, despite the fact that Doha, Declaration says it. I don't see anyone doing that at this stage. So I see that as less important. I'm not sure how important copyright is to, the production of COVID-related products or industrial design, for that matter. I can see that there is, there is probably something to do with regulatory approvals. But in a voluntary situation where the technology is voluntarily licensed, then the approvals are also easier. Regulatory approvals are easier. In a way, if it is, for instance, a subcontractor like Serum Institute is for AstraZeneca, then while you have to go through the regulatory approvals, those approvals would be easier to obtain than if you are completely an arm's length kind of licensee. However, just like the waiver, I don't think would be useful for the current pandemic, because these technologies are complex, as we've talked about, and they need voluntary cooperation and so on. Similarly, compulsory licensing would also not work. If the waiver doesn't work, compulsory licensing will also not work. So the EU proposal on trying to kind of modify or trying to amend compulsory licensing at the margins, this is how I understand the proposal, is also equally unhelpful. So it's not going to get you the production, that you need, and you need that urgently. Besides, anyway, I could probably leave this for another section of this, but we're running out of time. I just want to say that, at the end, we have, or we appear to have, we are promised 12 billion vaccine doses by the end of this year, which is quite a miracle. I mean, it's quite substantial. So today we have money, we have money, meaning the IMF has provided this SDR allocation of $650 billion, of which just low-income countries have $21 billion. So everyone has something, but even low-income countries have quite a substantial amount of money in foreign exchange. Yes, it is interest-paying loan. However, the interest rates are very, very low at this moment. And so I don't see, it's practically free money, which you have. So you have the money, you have the doses. What is it that you don't have? You don't have, in my view, the governance. So you don't have systems in place for the international community has not come together to put in coherent systems of governance to actually get these vaccine doses, which are going to be produced and which are quite adequate. By the middle of 2022, they will be quite adequate to cover the adult population of the world. Even then, we may not get there because we don't have, we don't have an efficient implementing agency. And that, I think, is a major problem, not an intellectual property waiver.
Thank you.
I don't think is important.
Yeah, on that, there's a comment in from Sean Murphy, who writes, many claim that the proposed TRIPS waiver was a solution in search of a problem. It's true that certain WTO members, such as India, South Africa, proposed the TRIPS waiver in the spring of 2020 when the COVID vaccines were still under development. If so, this means that IP rights were identified as the problem and blamed as a restriction on export access before any even existed, were on the market and received emergency approval. And so on, which is an interesting point. And Jim, another question from the floor from Andras Fehavari. Apologies, Andras, for my probable mispronunciation of your name. Given what Jayashri has just said, is there a risk or possibility that civil society will seek to update or amend TRIPS or issue some kind of revised Doha declaration that would cover trade secrets based on what's happened in the last year?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yes, there is a risk. That's why we're having this conversation, so that we can explore the consequences of moving in that direction. And I think, as Jayashri has just pointed out so eloquently, we need to think about those consequences very, very carefully when the problem ultimately isn't with the intellectual property framework or system. The problem is distribution and making sure that the materials that we have get to all the people in the world, within a time frame that matters. And it's a failure of governance in that regard, not a failure of the IP system, which is ironically the thing that brought these miraculous vaccines to us in the first place.
Mark Schultz, do you have anything to add on this topic? The dreaded
There have been
mute.
some stubborn premises at work here for the past year. And Philip and I started writing about this in I guess toward the end of winter of in 2020. Before many countries recognized there was a pandemic, and all along we've seen that IP skeptics have said that first, that intellectual property was going to impede the necessary sharing of information to combat the virus. That didn't happen. Information was shared, collaboration was started on a wide scale. Then intellectual property, we were told, was going to get in the way of developing vaccines. That didn't happen. Vaccines were developed in record time. Many different vaccines were developed. Then and now, where we are now, we're told that vaccines will get in the way of sharing information, of fully utilizing manufacturing capacity. We're told that's exactly what's happening right now. When in fact, and I really want to underline this point, it's information I haven't stated yet directly, it's in the paper, but what you need to understand, everyone should understand, is that nobody who is making vaccines is going it alone. In fact, they are already sharing secrets and know-how widely with dozens of partners across the world to produce vaccines as well as therapeutics, but vaccines as quickly as possible. So the paper documents partnerships in a wide variety of partnerships among the 5 leading vaccine manufacturers. We documented 41 partnerships with respect to manufacturing and 32 partnerships with respect to fill and finish. They are on every continent, including developing countries, including Brazil, South Africa, India, as well as many European countries, Mexico, other Latin American countries. And some of these agreements are with leading competitors who clearly would normally be considered a threat. Sanofi, Merck, and Novartis are manufacturing partners. And why can they do that? Because intellectual property rights, including trade secrets, create the necessary trust to do this. Because when you partner with a company like Sanofi or Merck or Novartis, you have to be very cautious. For BioNTech to partner with Pfizer, they are all very cautious, but they can do so because they believe they have legal recourse, because intellectual property rights create a background of trust. So there's already widespread sharing of information going on here. Intellectual property rights have not yet got in the way, even though people stubbornly cling to that premise. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We've got 4 minutes left. So I wanted to conclude with a question which I'll put to everyone. We'll start with Jayashri, move to Jim, and then Mark. So despite all that's happened, there's been a lot of doses in production, new vaccines produced in record time and all the rest of it. There's still political demand, particularly in low and middle income countries, for indigenous or local vaccine production capacity. Which I suppose is a reasonable political objective. What can be done to make this happen within the existing intellectual property framework? Does the WHO plan of creating regional manufacturing hubs have any legs, or are there other market-based solutions we can look to make this happen? Jayashri.
So thanks, Philip. I think quickly, the time to have done it is the time when the US and EU really gave a lot of money to the manufacturers who are today successful. Of course, there was money given also to those who weren't as successful. However, that's the time to put conditions. That's a market-based system. So you're putting in taxpayers' money, and that's the time when you put in conditions carefully, taking in view all of what was said in this session, particularly by Jim and Mark, about the implications for the future and so on, but taking all that into account. If something is really needed for humanity, public money is being put in, that's the time to put in conditions. Once that time is gone, it's very hard to see what kind of pressure you can have. You can have arm twisting, as they said, but I don't believe it's the rich countries that are going to do that arm twisting, and the poor countries are not capable of arm twisting, because if they try to twist arms of the patent owners or the trade secret owners, they will just leave that country. That market is not big enough. I mean, you have to be big enough for it to matter. So that I think is a problem. We'll have to see how mRNA hub in South Africa, the WHO mRNA hub in South Africa is going to work. For the moment, I don't see it going very far. There have to be market-based solutions. To my mind, it has to be done at the time when taxpayers' money is offered in large enough sums for it to make a difference to the technology owners.
Thanks. And briefly, Jim.
Yes, I agree to this extent that at an early time, there should be, when public money is going into a project, there should be some discussion about the way in which product, if it comes out and is successful, will be distributed. But we have to be very clear. Experience has shown that when governments try to put conditions on technology that's in development, private money tends to go away because they need to have control over, pricing and distribution and so forth in order to justify the investment. So we have to be it needs to be a light touch. But getting back to the point that Jayashri made earlier, we need to focus on distribution, because that is the problem that has kept us from getting these life-saving medications and the vaccines to billions of people earlier.
Thank you, Jim. And briefly, Mark, thank you.
Sure. So one point is that there are impressively large amounts of public money that have been invested, but we should also recall that it's typically been preceded by large amounts of private money. So Moderna, by many estimates, received about $1 billion to help in developing its mRNA COVID vaccine, but over $6 billion had been invested in building Moderna and building that technology platform beforehand. That was all private money. So that was money that was at risk, and they owed a duty to their shareholders, and that the future Modernas might not be willing to cooperate if that billion versus the 6 billion, if that billion puts the 6 billion at risk. Second quick point, just today, I think the larger problem is not manufacturing capacity, it's vaccine nationalism. The wealthy countries really stepped up and helped make this happen by ordering many doses, more than they needed. They took many chances by committing to buy vaccines that were produced, if successful, from many manufacturers. But they now have commitments for more doses than they need. And there are countries like the US and others talking about third, fourth, or even fifth doses, even for healthy young people. And I think first we need to consider the wealthy countries releasing manufacturers from some of those pre-commitments so that those doses can go to the highest risk people around the world, and the doses are distributed more equitably. Vaccine nationalism is a much bigger problem than intellectual property or manufacturing capacity.
Thanks, Mark. A nice way to conclude. I urge everyone to read Mark's paper. Just to share the link again. Sorry we've crept past the hour a few minutes, but I'd like to thank our guests, Jayashri, Jim, and Mark, for a very stimulating discussion. We'll put the video on YouTube so you can share it amongst those who are also interested. But thank you very much, and we hope to see you at the next Geneva Network webinar. Thank you very much again. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.